You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Honored and privileged once again to be behind the Golden Dixie Heritage microphone and to bring you another episode of TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. Our guest this week is Harald Hesstvedt Scharnhorst. And Harald is an author of the book An Immigrant Remembers. Harald had an interesting story. He grew up in Nazi-occupied Norway during World War II. His father was a hero of World War II. His father had actually been a very wealthy businessman in Norway, and he personally raised and financed an army to push back the German invasion of Norway. As Harald will tell us, it wasn't that they had anything against Germans, they just did not like invaders. His father led the country's effort to fight back, and then after the war, he and his family emigrated to the United States, and so as a young boy, Harald had to learn a new language and adapt a new culture and make friends and, be the foreign kid until he did. And it was an interesting story. Of course, Harald would grow up to be in the U.S. Army. He would grow up to be a radio and television personality, as well as a journalist and an author. And he worked in various aspects of the news business, of the television and radio businesses. He also became a pilot and flew one of the news planes. Just a very interesting person. And we talk about a number of subjects. We talk, of course, about World War II. We talk about legal and illegal immigration. We talk about a number of things. And so I know that you'll enjoy the conversation. So without any more introduction, here's our interview with Harald Scharnhorst. Please do make a note that Harald lives up in Montana. The cell reception is not very good in Montana, and that becomes very evident during several places in our telephone conversation. So please, you'll enjoy the interview with Harald, but please just bear in mind that the audio quality is not always the best, but it was out of our control. I think the only celebrity that I ever asked for an autograph was Tommy Lasorda.
Oh, really? Did he give it to you?
He did.
I'll be darned.
And the only reason that I asked him for it, and it's funny because years later, Tommy became a Christian.
Right.
And he actually apologized for the incident afterwards. I was at a baseball game in Melbourne, Florida. I was at a spring training game in Melbourne, Florida, and Tommy Lasorda came down and sat down next to me. I was seated up in the front there, right behind home plate, and Tommy, I guess, decided that he could get a better view from down there than he could get from up in the box, and so he came down and sat next to me, and he sat there for, I would say, probably the bottom of the first, through the end of the game, and somewhere around the fourth or fifth inning, I handed, I talked to him a little bit, and although it wasn't that we had a whole lot of conversation, because he was on his cell phone a lot with things going on with the gang, lineup changes and things that he wanted to see, and other people had come up and asked him for an autograph and things, but we had talked for just a few seconds, and he had asked me what I did for a living, and I told him I was a pastor, and so I reached in my pocket and I handed him a gospel tract. And it was How to Go to Heaven by Dr. Ford Porter. And it had the church's address and everything on the back of it. And I handed it to him, and he just looks at me, he goes, "I don't need that, I'm a Catholic."
Oh, okay.
And I'm like, "Well, you don't have to go to our church, but you're more than welcome to keep it." And he goes, "No, I don't want it." And so I said, "Well, okay, if you're gonna refuse it so adamantly, would you at least autograph it for me so I can remember that that's the gospel tract that Tommy Lasorda didn't want?" And so he scribbled an autograph on it and handed it back to me.
That's hilarious. I was going to ask you what religion he was, and you answered my question, so that's fine.
And about 6 years later, he became a Christian, and I remember watching him on television. He was giving his testimony, and he told the story. He said, I probably could have become a Christian sooner. There was a preacher who tried to talk to me about Jesus at a baseball game, and I autographed his gospel tract and handed it back to him.
Isn't that funny? Well, there's an awful lot of misinformation in the religious world. There's a lot of portions of the Bible or tracts in the Bible that are really, really excellent. I particularly like people like Titus, for example, but it's never talked about.
Well, I'm getting ahead of myself in an interview here. In Norway, what is the predominant religion in Norway?
Norway is Lutheran.
Okay, so
it's Lutheran. So it is Lutheran, and though there are other people there today, I mean, there are different religions there. There probably are some Seventh-day Adventists, probably a few Mormons, and probably a few Catholics, but predominantly it's a state religion. It is an uncircumcised country.
So then, were you raised in Lutheranism in Norway, or was Christianity something that you discovered after you came to America?
I would say a little of both. I was christened in Norway in Frogner Church, which is the big church in Oslo, the capital where I was born. But as far as becoming, deeply involved in Christianity, we were not a deeply Christian people in that sense. A lot of people in Norway, they're members of the church, and they go to church once in a while, particularly on Easter and Christmas, but the majority of them are not heavily into that sort of stuff. So we became more acquainted with that after coming to this country and settling in Escondido, California, where there were 80-some churches. So, you could take your pick as to what you wanted to do.
Wow. I didn't realize there were that many in California.
Yeah, there really are. I mean, when you look at the United States, there's probably something like 2,000 denominations in this country.
How is California as messed up as it is if it has so many churches?
Well, this was the thing my mother asked. When we came here, we were kind of shy about everything. We didn't want controversy, and we didn't want to offend anybody. You know how that is, especially when you're new. We would be invited to churches, and my mother would say, well, okay, which is the best church? And people would say, oh, well, we think our church is the best. It's kind of mind-blowing. You look at this, and you just say to yourself, well, wait a minute. How come so many?
We're going to talk about your book and some things. One thing that I wanted to ask you about, because I saw this in the news yesterday, is that up in your area, yesterday, or maybe it was Tuesday, I'm not for sure, but I saw it in the news yesterday. There was a young boy who was diagnosed with bubonic plague.
Okay.
And it was the first diagnosis of bubonic plague since the 90s or something like that, they were saying.
Oh, really? That is really unusual, because you don't hear stuff like that. There was a bunch of bubonic plague and related things taking place down in Yosemite National Park in California. I remember reading about that, maybe a year or so ago. But no, I'm not familiar with this story at all. This is a new one on me.
Okay.
Like, for example, in this country, we subscribe to the International Sanitary Regulation. And International Sanitary Regulation number 27 allows for quarantining of people. And yet we have so-called immigrants who come into this country under the refugee status who have tuberculosis and all sorts of other things, and nothing is done about it.
Well, that is definitely something that I wanted to talk to you about today, was immigration, given the fact that you yourself are an immigrant.
Yes. See, there's two kinds of immigrants. You have those who came here as quota immigrants. We were legal immigrants. We had this whole test. We had to have a sponsor, and we had to sign a statement saying that we would never be a burden to the U.S. government. Think about that one for a while.
Right.
So our situation is completely different from that of the refugees. Like up here where I live, for example, people have just raised holy dickens and said, hey, we do not want those people resettled here. And I agree with them. They don't want people brought in here who are going to disturb the quiet and the environment that we have.
So how many refugees were settled in your area?
None.
Okay, that's very good.
But you go to Wyoming, and there are places over there, they've brought in thousands of them. And the people locally here just do not feel that we can handle that. We don't have the tax base to justify giving these people free lunch, and we don't want the crime. We have no murders here to speak of. If there is a murder here in the last 30 years, I can only think of a half a dozen people have been murdered. But that's how little crime we have. And what little crime we do have is usually petty stuff and things that are related to drugs. But we don't have a lot of minorities here. We have a handful of Indians, and there's a few Orientals off and on. There's a few others, but all of them get along. It's not like they're a sore thumb. They're not causing a problem. They run a business, they have this or they have that, and they're just part of the environment, and nobody cares.
Right.
But when you start bringing in people who come from an area where they have no education, no ability, no nothing, it's awful. Like I happened to hear an interview, just must have been the day before yesterday, with two young men who were missionaries to Zimbabwe. And what they had to say was shocking, to say the least. They said the lands are fallow. You know, the farmlands that used to be run by white farmers were given to black people, and they don't know how to farm them, so they go fallow. And the people starve. And many of these people don't even have any idea just how bad off they are, and they listen to the government propaganda. And they get mad when you suggest to them that things could be different.
In the upcoming July-August issue of the Barnes Review, I've got an article in there on the genocide of white farmers, and particularly in South Africa.
Right.
And it's the same situation. They take the farms and the houses and everything from the white people, that there'll be no retribution from the government for doing so. So they're just going around people and taking their stuff, and again, they don't know what to do with it.
Well, yeah, that's not the nature of the native. You know, the native tribes of Africa were backward. You know, I have a friend who's a black Zulu from South Africa, and he's a very well-educated man. Sent me some pictures years ago about Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, and he sent me 13 pictures of his palace, and they were published in an article 2 years ago in the Barnes Review entitled "Ruination of a Nation" under my name. And he's a very well-educated man. He's tribal in a lot of ways, and he gets mad just like the average person down there does. But he was telling me some horror stories. He said the South African government doesn't dare shut off power if you don't pay your power bill, because the first thing that happens is that the blacks will dig up the power lines and they'll sell the copper on the black market.
Wow.
Wow is right. So this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with people who just have, you know, they have an IQ of 65, 70, a lot of those people. And smart ones, what they do is they just become the new dictators, and they walk all the hand up. And the situation is so bad in South Africa that the electric power company there, they make money, all right, but they spend all the money instead of, you know, spending some of it on infrastructure so that they improve their power generating facility. No, they don't think that way. They just think, oh, well, the money comes in, that means we can spend it.
Well, do they make money on their actual power generation, or do you think they're simply making money because they've got foreign countries that are giving them grants and aid?
Well, I think it's the latter. They're getting lots of grants. You know, the West wants a dependent country. They didn't want Rhodesia. Rhodesia was independent, had a better currency than we have, and they were exporting things, you know, farm goods and everything to other places, and black people were flocking there for jobs because they were available. It was almost a perfect country in many ways, even though I doubt that any country is really perfect. But it was far more perfect than when communist Mugabe took over and just absolutely wrecked the place, and then turns around and blames the white people for all of his trouble.
Right. So your native Norway is now undergoing a massive immigration wave of, you know, the European Union's trying to see just how many Africans they can send up there.
Well, you know, I have a nephew who is an absolute jackass. And he's one of these people that thinks that everybody's the same and it's perfectly okay to do that. And there are a lot of people in Sweden and Norway that think that way. They have this nurturing ability. Oh, we've got to help these people. And they don't realize that what they're doing is they're bringing in a Trojan horse that's going to invade them at some. They're not all like that. There's a growing number of people in Norway who recognize, hey, we don't want these people here. It seems like everybody has to reinvent the wheel. We've learned this lesson in America, and Norway, who likes to copy America, doesn't seem to see the same lesson. And part of the problem over there is that you have too many socialists, too many one-worlders, too many, how can I say it, bleeding heart. And they're very liberal, and they think that they have everything, and they just need to help everybody. And if they help everybody, the things will do well. In a general sense, it won't work, just as it hasn't worked here.
Let's kind of go backwards a little bit. And
go ahead.
And why don't you tell me, you said that you were 9 years old when your family emigrated from Norway.
Yep.
When you were 9 years old, what do you think it was that made your father decide that he wanted to take his family and move to the United States?
On second thought, Harold, looking at the time, let's break here for a brief word from our sponsor, the Barnes Review. And then after that brief commercial, we'll come back and you can answer that question about what inspired your father to move your family to the United States.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Okay, first of all, Dad was very much like many of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. They spent their own money to finance the war. My dad did the same thing. He was a prosperous businessman in Oslo. He had a very large ladies' wear store, and I have pictures and everything of that in my book. And he was of the opinion that when the Nazis invaded Norway, that was something that was not acceptable to the Norwegian people. Not because we disliked Germans, but simply because nobody likes an invader. So he devoted 5 years of his time and considerable of his money to help equip and partially equip a Norwegian fighting force. And of course that was tremendously accepted, and after it was all over, he got his accolades, including the medal from the British King, which is a medal for freedom and medal for valor in the cause of freedom. And I still have the medal, and I've included pictures and that in the book. So Dad was kind of a shaker and mover in the country. And when the war was over, the first thing that happened is that the bureaucrats came back, the Nazis came back, the new Nazis, and they say, oh, you can't move into this house, you can't do this, and you can't do that because you have to have government permission. So in essence, things didn't really improve that terribly much after the war. They did later with the coming of the oil situation and all that, which is something we could never have seen in advance. But so these were things that upset my father, and in the long run, he decided that, well, maybe the grass is greener elsewhere. We heard about this wonderful country called America, and one thing led to another.
What was your reaction when you were a 9-year-old and your dad told you that you were going to leave Norway and go to the United States?
Well, I loved my father. I really loved my father. Whatever my father wanted to do was fine with me. However, when I came to the United States and I ended up going to school, I found out that I was involved in a terrorist camp. I was beaten up at school and humiliated and all the things that usually happen to people that are different. So that's when I first started to realize that things were different here. And while I eventually developed friends and all that sort of stuff, the point is the initial shock of it was a culture shock. And that's something that every immigrant, whether he's legal or whether he isn't, has to go through.
When you were a child, and even, now you have the wisdom of adulthood looking back on it, if you could do it over again, would you have stayed in Norway or would you have still come to the United States?
I would have stayed in Norway.
You would have stayed in Norway?
Yep, and it has nothing to do with America not being good. It simply is, it would have been a better deal for us. If Father had continued to do the things that he always did, in other words, to continue to get involved in politics and do everything he could to represent, let's see, the right rather than the left, I think that would have probably been better for him. But on the other hand, who's to say that anyone can be Monday morning quarterback? I'm more than grateful for my American citizenship, and I'm more than grateful for being here. I have a family, and I have a nice place to live, and I have nothing to complain about. But what I do is I put myself in a position where I use the information that I have to write letters. I write a blog that I have, and I've recently started posting on Gab, and I'm kind of a critic of sorts. And since I'm not political in the sense that I belong to the political party, I am free to say whatever I darn please.
Had you ever thought about, maybe when you became an adult or at any point in your adult life, had you ever contemplated moving back to Norway, or by the time you had become an adult, you were already settled in your life in America? How did that go for you?
Well, it's both. I was settled here, and so the tendency is to stay with what you know. But yes, I did, and I had a half-brother. My father had two families, and I was the first in the second family. And so I met one of my half-brothers, who was about 15 years old or 20 years older than me, and I really loved the guy. He was a great guy, and he was a very famous meteorologist who spoke at the University of Southern California. So he came over one time, and he came down and visited with us, and of course he invited me to Norway, and I thought about it, and I thought, yeah, I would like to do that. But the guy had cancer, and he died a few years later, and that just kind of ended that dream. So, there are sometimes unintended consequences that we run into in life, and that was one of them.
Have you visited Norway since coming to America, or is it just a childhood memory now?
Well, no, I have not. I speak the language fluently, so I'm fluent in Norwegian. I read it and write it and all that kind of stuff. And I'm fluent, of course, in English. with relatively little accent. And I speak a few other languages like I speak French and German and a little bit of Portuguese off and on.
Okay.
But other than that, no, I've not been back to Europe, although I am going back to Europe in September. I have some friends over there who've invited me, and I'm going to go over there for a few weeks and have a good time. Right.
You know,
I spent 3 years in the military stationed in France, and that was a wonderful time for me because I visited some 25 different countries, and they included Spain and Morocco, and I didn't get to Portugal. So I have a friend in Portugal who's invited me, and I'm going to go back there sometime in September and spend a few weeks with him. It's going to be wonderful.
So you'd mentioned military service. What, were you drafted, or was your enlistment, was it a patriotic?
Well, that's an interesting question. You know, at the time, you didn't have an option. We had a draft on in 1963. And it was not a question of, will you go? It's, you got to go. And the other thing is, I had applied for citizenship. And you can't very well be a conscientious objector and say, I want citizenship in this great land, and not want to serve in the military. So the whole thing was a conundrum. So rather than be drafted and sent to Vietnam as some kind of a cannon fodder, what I did is I used my brain and I volunteered. So instead of being 2 years, I was 3 years in the military, and I went to Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, where I studied signal and ended up working in the Signal Corps for that time period. And I got promoted right along, so by the time I had been 2 years in the military, I was already a sergeant. The military experience for me was wonderful. I met a lot of really interesting young men, and a lot of them were very liberal. We never discussed politics because I had a security clearance, and so I stuck to my work, and I took my off time. I bought a car, and I traveled all over Europe, and I was probably one of the most well-traveled men in the whole area. My recollections of the military are quite interesting. I've written a whole chapter about that in my book here because there's a lot of similarity between my experiences in the military and my father's. We've included that in it as well, and I learned things I didn't want to know. There were many things I couldn't talk about for years. I can talk about them now, but I couldn't for years. Things that would curl the toes on your toenails.
I had a man, I was a pastor in New Mexico. We had a deacon in the church, and he had driven a tank during the Second World War. And his job was that they would airdrop the tank onto an island. And you parachute down, and then what he would do is he would drive it into the jungle. And there was a flamethrower on the front of the tank, where normally there would be a cannon.
Right.
And he would shoot napalm, and he would basically burn, a path through the jungle so that when the ground troops got there, they can march through the path and take the island.
Exactly. It's the only way you could do it.
Yeah. And he said that, the only thing he could see was through his viewfinder. But he said that these Japanese would be in the jungle, and he didn't know they were there until he would start napalming the path in the jungle, and he said these Japanese people would just start running out and they would be on fire. And he said that every night, and that was back in the 1940s, and this was in the mid-2000s. This was 2007, 2008. And he would wake up every night to the image of Japanese men burning to death, to that image he saw through the viewfinder. He said he doesn't know how many dozens of them that he saw. That's what wakes him up every night in the middle of the night.
Well, it's interesting to see how our subconscious plays games with us. That made such an impression on him because he knew that it basically was wrong, and yet he had the right to do it. I was fortunate I didn't get involved in the killing game. If I had been forced to, I probably would be a different person today than I am. But on the other hand, the military changes all of us a little bit. And it certainly did mature me in a number of ways, but it also made me aware of the futility of it all. War is a business racket, Ed. That's all it is. It has very little to do with what's right and wrong, and it has very little to do with causes. But it's a wonderful business arrangement. I was reading an article here, and I posted this to Gab the other day. And that was that in 2017, the American military, that is to say the Department of Defense, has admitted to killing 500 civilians around the world. Now, what in the name of Hades are they doing that?
I have no idea.
Yeah, me neither. Well, what they're busy doing is they're busy sticking their nose up everybody else's backsides and doing things they shouldn't be doing. And in the process, people get in the way. And so, we're going to eliminate them. And so I can understand why America today isn't always well liked around the world. We do pretty much the same thing as the Israelis do, and that is not be very nice to others.
Well, I'm still trying to wrap my head around the fact that we have the Army in 140 countries around the world. I can't imagine.
Well, we are sticking our nose. We're basically the enforcement arm of the military-industrial complex. We're the ones doing the dirty work for the people that benefit from this.
Call me crazy, and I'm going to put this on the air, and I'm going to get a backlash from this, I know. And it's not that I don't applaud the president's accomplishment in denuclearizing the North Korean country, because, you know, that's one fewer threat that we have in the world.
Yep.
But if the United States is a sovereign country and can protect itself with nuclear weapons, and if Russia's a sovereign country that can protect itself with nuclear weapons, if Great Britain's a nuclear country that can protect itself with nuclear weapons, why doesn't North Korea have the right to protect itself with nuclear weapons?
Well, see, this is the whole joke that most people don't get. And you're absolutely right. I totally agree with you. If you're going to have these things, why shouldn't everybody have them? Well, obviously, what it is, they're trying to neutralize certain individuals and bring them under the envelope. Look what they did to Gaddafi and what they've tried to do to Assad. And it's all trying to bring all these people under the economic umbrella. And that's what this is all about.
Well, you know, you mentioned Gaddafi and Assad. Do you realize that, and you can expand the list a little bit, it dawned on me at some point when I was in college that there were 7 nations that did not have a Rothschild central bank. The list, Libya was on the list, Syria was on the list, Iran and Iraq were on the list, North Korea's on the list, Russia's on the list, and...
Yep. That's the whole game right in a nutshell.
And if you look at the countries that are being taken out and the leaders that are being taken out, of course, Saddam resisted the whole central banking idea, as has Iran, as has North Korea, as has Russia.
So, you know, while they're touting, or Trump is touting that this is such a good idea of dealing with North Korea, what he's really doing is he's doing the bidding of the Rothschilds.
Am I naive? Because, believe me, I see what's going on. I realize that, for example, President Trump had said he was going to pull the soldiers out of Syria, and then the next he's bombing Syria, and I would like to believe that he's being played. In other words, that there are people that are able to broker events in such a way to force him to have to do their bidding. So
I totally agree with that.
Okay, so then I'm not naive then in giving the president the benefit of the doubt.
No, I think it's always wise to give people the benefit of the doubt. This is what I do. Until I find out that it's quite obvious that something's wrong, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. That's the fair thing to do in all cases, because I'd want people to do that for me. So it shouldn't be one rule for me and one rule for you and another rule for somebody else. You kind of have to play by the same rules. So I'm willing to give them a certain amount of rope, just like you look back in the days of Clinton, you know, going all the way back to the Watergate time, and Hillary Rodham was a crook back then.
Right.
So, I mean, after a while, you kind of, so you add up all these little scorecards after a while, and it's quite obvious that she's a big team player, and that's why she's not in jail.
Well, even now, it appears that Jeff Sessions is scrambling to cover for her, which makes absolutely no sense. But
no, they're covering for her and for Bill. You know, it's the pizza game. You know, what's his name, Podesta and Prince Andrew and all the rest of these people. I mean, these guys have nothing better to do in life than to find weird things to do to satisfy their own whatever it is they're satisfying. In the process, they're committing some awful crimes, and naturally when they get exposed, the first thing they do is go, oh, no, we didn't do that. And then it gets slammed down. And anytime someone criticizes someone else in a manner that's going to hurt their living or their personal being, you can generally figure that those are the people that are ruling them.
I'm going to kind of step back a second, and I'm going to ask you a question about your childhood in Norway, and then we're going to talk about your book.
Okay.
My wife and I were on a cruise recently.
Uh-huh.
And our waiter in the dining room, his name was Oscar, and he was Norwegian. You would have known he was Norwegian even if his name tag didn't have the little Norwegian flag on it.
Right.
Just from his facial features and his blonde hair and his accent and his mannerism, you would have known he was Norwegian.
Definitely.
But he and I got to talking, and I was telling him that I had lived in Alaska briefly.
Aha.
And we were talking about the diet there in Alaska, and I'd asked him if the diet in Norway was similar, and he said that it was. And I told him, I said, when I came back down to the continental United States, I said I was so excited to eat beef again.
Oh,
And Oscar, he told me, he said that that's exactly what happens every time I get on the cruise ship.
isn't that?
You know, that he can eat
You know,
beef,
people,
you know. And so when you were a child growing up in Norway, you know, the diet in Norway, I guess, versus the diet in the United States.
was horribly different.
Yes.
You know, first of all, a lot of the European countries are very bread oriented. And by bread, I don't mean Wonder bread. I don't mean this white stuff that, you know, you can squeeze into a little ball and toss it. I'm talking about stuff that has substance and that has both bran layers and wheat germ in it. And so a lot of these countries in Europe are very much that way. And they're also fish oriented, and they're oriented to some kinds of meat. But you have to remember that beef didn't become important in the world until about the time of the Civil War in the United States. And now it's kind of been exported to the whole world. If it hadn't been for some of the big ranchers in Texas and elsewhere in the United States who really promoted the concept of beef, we wouldn't have as much beef being eaten as there is today. That's something people don't even stop to realize. So before that time, it was more small meat, with side meat and other things that were used. And the same thing is true in Norway. You know, there wasn't room there for beef. There isn't wide open spaces where you can just pasture beef. So it tended to be more dairy cattle, it tended to be more cheese, it tended to be more egg-oriented and perhaps more pig-oriented with vegetables as well as fruits. So that was kind of the diet. We came to the United States and we couldn't find any good bread. And so, my goodness gracious, you know, our diet not only changed, but so did our health. And that often happens to immigrants who come from an area where the mineralization is really good, and they move to another area where mineralization is not very good, and they go through a couple of generations of adjustment. So there's a big difference in how those people eat and how we do. But of course, over the years, what has happened is that certain things that we have in this country, especially beef and that sort of stuff, has been exported to other countries, and it's become popular there.
So you had mentioned to me yesterday when we were chatting that your father, when he came to the United States, actually opened up a bakery to bring that European-style, Norwegian-style bread to California.
That's what we did. And today, that's universal. I mean, that whole idea has been spread around so that you can find just about anything you want in this country now. So this was the pioneer effort that was made, and so it was extremely successful in that sense. And although our business was really good, Dan wanted to kind of expand this thing, and so he tried to franchise it. And of course, franchising it is a great idea, but there are some things that just are not franchised. And the more labor-intensive they are, and the more ethnic they are, and the more specialized, more that is. And so this is something we learned kind of the hard way. So we had a successful business, and our family made out very well during the time that we lived here, up until the time my folks passed on. The point is that not everybody can do that. Not everybody can be an artist. Not everybody can do all the same thing. I'm a great photographer, but I can't draw. You know, this is just how we are as people.
And so you didn't feel baking was your calling then, as far as taking over the family business?
In the long run, no, because at the time I wasn't even married, and I really needed to be married. In order to make a business like that work, you really need 2 or 3 people, and so I ended up going into the building trades instead, and I've done well in that. And while I was working with my parents, I also was very much interested in the broadcast industry, so I ended up going into that. I did that as well as working with my folks. So I had a career in that for 20 years. I bought an airplane and used that for news reporting and stuff of that nature, and also for Hollywood. So I've done a lot of different things in my life, and it's been a really good and rewarding life, and I've enjoyed all of it. But every time you get involved in these different things, you find out that there are certain restrictions on what you can do and can't do. You can say, and there are some things you better not say.
Did you accidentally or intentionally say something that you shouldn't have said, or did you just realize that the deck was stacked and so you moved on?
No, I did have the good sense. I've written quite a bit about this in my books, and I had a program director in the station that I worked for who made a mistake one day. It was an innocent remark, really, but the reaction was unbelievable. It was, if you want to keep working here, you don't say stuff like that. And 2 weeks later, he was history.
So then you were able to learn from your boss's mistake so that you didn't have to make the same mistake yourself, which no doubt would have been very painful had you made it.
It's like the old story about the 17-year-old who knew everything, you know, and he wanted to go into the military, and he thought his dad was the biggest dork in the world. So he spent 4 years traveling the world as part of the Navy. And then he came home and he was amazed at how much his old man had learned.
Yeah.
That's kind of the way it works. So I've come to the conclusion that there were some things that I thought when I was young that were frankly not quite correct. And as I've gone along, I got more information and had more experience. And I realized that it wasn't important that I was always right. It was more important what was right. And if I was wrong, well, that's okay. I don't have to continue to think wrong. I can simply change my mind for the right reasons. And if more people did that, I think we would all be happier people. I think we would be more successful. And I think we would benefit enormously from that.
Well, you've been around the broadcast business long enough to know that every so often we have to pause for a commercial. So we're going to do that here. We're going to have a word from our sponsor, the American Free Press. And then we'll be back with our guest, Harald Scharnhorst.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net.
We're back with our guest, Harald Scharnhorst. Harald, before the break, we talked about your childhood and we talked about your immigrating from Norway to the United States. Tell us exactly what you and your family had to do in order to legally immigrate to the United States.
Okay, that's a very good subject. You know, I have a number of friends up here who are border patrolmen. And I've discussed this with them in detail, and they say, well, the same rules apply today. They're just not being handled correctly. This conversation took place during the time Obama was president. Basically, what you have to do is you have to apply for residency in the United States. You had to not live in the United States. You had to live outside the U.S. in order to apply. You could live in Norway and Mexico, Portugal, doesn't matter where, but you had to apply from outside the United States. And part of the requirements is that you be admitted under what is known as the quota system, which was designed in the early part of the 1900s to limit the number of people that would come from any particular country. So every year there's a quota, so many Norwegians could be admitted to the country. And if you happen to come in under that quota, then of course you could be admitted theoretically that year, or if you didn't that year, you'd have the next one. You had to be certified as being healthy. You had to be certified as not being a Nazi. you had to have some money. You had to have an American sponsor, someone who would be responsible for you if you didn't make it in the U.S. You had to sign a statement saying that you would not be a burden to the U.S. government. In other words, you couldn't come to the United States and say, oh, I'm just so poor, how about feeding me? You had to pull yourself up by bootstraps, and you had to make up that way. So those are some of the requirements that are required of people that come to the United States as an immigrant.
And what possessed you, what inspired you to write your book?
After having looked at my life and looked at the things that are talked about today, I realized how utterly timely this particular book, An Immigrant Remembers, really is. And I also wanted to honor some of the people who fought in the underground, the Hjemmefront, as they call them, the home front, in Norway during the Nazi occupation. Why did they do this? And I describe in detail what their motivations were, what caused them to do this, and how many risks they were willing to take, and how they were able to fool the Germans in so many ways, and how the British helped them, and how the British didn't help, how the British screwed up royally. And so it goes into a lot of detail on this sort of stuff. And there is so much information readily available. I've included, for example, about some 50 books that are reference material. And some of them are books that are not well read by a lot of people, but they are books that are extremely important because they talk about the details that are so missing today. We hear about the Holocaust, we hear all this crap, but we don't hear all the details about the people that actually participated in various countries. And there have been a couple of books written about the Norwegian underground, and I've listed a few of them in the bibliography, but only one or two of them have actually been published in English. And so I figured that I would add to the cesspool of knowledge, if you will, and do so by being able to give firsthand information from the notes that my mother left behind. She left behind some 180 handwritten pages. And it's from that I was able to reconstruct a lot of stuff, and also from my own memory. My father was one of these kind of people that didn't run around with a Napoleonic air. He didn't praise himself. He didn't say, oh, I did a great thing. He let other people do that if they chose. And he was somewhat tight-lipped about things. A lot of soldiers are like that. I ran into that when I was in the military. Soldiers don't all write books, and for a lot of sometimes good reasons, and sometimes not. And I decided that I wanted to put all this stuff down on paper so that it would be available to other people if they're interested, and would also be available as a research volume. I have quoted in there a guy named William Jewett, who was a famous Britisher. He made the comment that there's no sense in writing history because, after all, you're only going to get a biased history, and because you're going to get a biased history, we may as well cover it all up. So this is the kind of idiocy these people believe in. And I also did something else when I put this book together, and I spent a lot of time doing the preface. And I've come to the conclusion, Ed, that there's about 7 different kinds of history. They include your point of view, my point of view, research volumes, people like myself who write autobiographies or biographies, and cartoonists, and, of course, the propagandists. So you have a total of about 7 different kinds of history, and all of them have their own little quirks that they like to promote. And the only way you're going to figure everything out is simply to study them all. Because if you don't, you're going to have a rather distorted view of history. So these were all things that motivated me to write. And I'm so glad I did. I'm glad I took the 4 years to do it, because it took quite a bit of time to word things in a manner that's readable and enjoyable, and it sounds like a story, while at the same time having its reference materials that are historically accurate.
Is it probably the only book of its kind?
I would say it's the only book of its kind, yeah. There are other books that are written on various subjects. For example, there's a fellow, and I've listed him in my book. I've mentioned his little story briefly, and his name was Gunvald Ponstad. And he was one who ran an illegal Morse code transmitter at a place called Flekkefjord, which is on the very southern tip of Norway. And he was instrumental in feeding to the home station in London the information on German shipping that was going out through the Skagerrak, which is the isthmus between Norway and Denmark, and out into the North Sea. And he was the one that sent the message on the Bismarck, and that, of course, resulted in the sinking of the Bismarck. So there's one guy that was a rather significant player. There's a statue to him in his town to this day. And there were others, too, participated in the war, and there were a number of books written. But there's only 2 books that have been written in English that I know of. One of them is called We All Die Alone, and it's the story of Jan Balsrud and a botched attempt to insert troops into Norway and northern Norway. And then there's a book that has to do with Tomstad, and I think it's called In the Shadow of the Gestapo, and it's written by a Norwegian-American woman who also wrote a famous Norwegian cookbook. And that's available on the internet. Those are about the only 2 books that I'm aware of that are actually in English. The rest of them are popular in Europe, and they're popular in Norway, but we don't hear much about it. So this was kind of an attempt to add another feature to the potpourri.
When were you born?
41.
Okay, so then you were alive during the Nazi invasion of Norway, and you were alive during the time of which you write, but I'm going to guess your personal memories are probably very fuzzy at best.
Yes, that is a true statement. Very few of us can remember back when we were 1, 2, 3, or 4 years of age. However, we have a couple of tools that are very useful. One is, let's say you have a mother or a father who inculcates in you a certain amount of information. And let's say that you also have a mother and father who took a lot of pictures. And taking pictures in Norway during the Second World War was a very risky thing because all of that was censored. And any time the pictures were developed by Kodak or others in Norway, well, of course, there was a German censor sitting there looking at things to see if they could find any kind of picture of someone that might be of interest to them, such as a member of the underground. So the pictures that survived are not that many, but what the pictures do is they tell 1,000 words. I mean, you can look at a picture and you can see that a child is doing certain things. You can see that adults are doing certain things. And what this is used for then is kind of substantiating what is said in a narrative that has been taught to you, in this case by my mother, and she had the niceness enough to write this stuff down. And while it was never published, I decided that I would publish it, so that's kind of what I've done. So yes, is not real information. People aren't. But my memory became very much acute into the 6, 7, 8, and 9 year age bracket. For example, I'd written my very first article. I like to write. And so I'd written my very first article when I was 9 years and 3 months old. And I was of the opinion from my memory that it was 12 years. Well, I happened to find a copy of the article that I'd written, and of course it had a date on it. And so that's how I can prove exactly that it was 9 years and 3 months. So evidence is really important when you're trying to recall history and you're trying to combine it with, let's say, the testimony of your mother, father, or others. And you can actually come up with some very accurate information if you just combine all this. So this is kind of what I did. So I've been very fortunate that we've kept these wonderful records, not to mention some of the publications that were published at the end of the war, which gives lots of details. I've shown pictures and this sort of stuff about it so that people can kind of see for themselves exactly what took place. And there were also some honest news reporters at the time, too. And believe it or not, some of them were from CBS. And some of them were from Australia and from Britain as well. And I listed these people and talked about their reports and what they actually saw and who handled them. So from that standpoint, then you can kind of get the idea that it isn't just my memory that I'm using here, but I'm using a lot of different facts that all play together and generate a picture that's remarkably accurate.
So how does someone go about getting a copy of your book?
Well, we have a small publishing outfit. It's located in a little town called Moye Springs, Idaho. And the address is Homefront Publishing, Box 55 in Moye Springs. That's spelled Moye, Springs, Idaho, 83845. We also have a Facebook page, Homefront Publishing on Facebook. And I post on Gab as Harald Scharnhorst. I also have a blog, which you'll find the link to on my Facebook page. And I have some 100 articles on a variety of different subjects, everything from from political stuff to pictures to interesting things that have happened. There's just a whole list of them. You just kind of have to go through it and see what interests you and look at them. So these are ways that you can locate us. I'm a rather public person, and I don't make any effort to hide, so I'm easily found by...
One last thing that I want to talk about is, how does an immigrant from Norway who grew up in California...
You're fading out on me. Try that again, Ed.
How does an immigrant from Norway who grew up in California and who is now living in Montana...
How is it that happens?
No, how is it that you can subscribe to the Dixie Heritage Letter and to be a supporter of Confederate heritage?
Okay, first of all, I'm a rebel of sorts, and I'm a rebel supporter. I just think those Southern folks are just mighty fine folks, and I just love their accent. I'm not making fun of you. I'm not making fun of you. My sister actually married an Okie. She married a guy from Guthrie, Oklahoma. So, and he was one of these wonderful people. And I wrote letters back and forth to my sister. And one day I had occasion to call her. And she answered the phone, and I couldn't recognize her. And I said, well, I want to speak with Elizabeth. And she said, why, this is Elizabeth? And I said, good heavens. I said, you sound just like an Okie. And she said, I do. She had lived there for about 3 or 4 years and had absorbed the Southern culture to such an extent that it modified her speech. So, I've had connections with the South for a long time. I've also been involved with the Barnes Review and also the American Free Press. And as a result, I'm fairly knowledgeable on the South. So I found your newsletter actually as a result of being involved with those organizations. And you might be interested to know that in the back of my book, I do have a bibliography, and a couple of the books that are on there. One of them is The South Was Right. That's the Kennedy brothers. Another one is Rebel Private Front and Rear by William A. Fletcher, which is a beautiful book on the Civil War. And I even did an article for TBR on that one. And so I guess you could say that I've always had this affinity for Southerners. Of course, it's because basically they're my people. There's a lot of Scottish, there's a lot of Norwegians, there's a lot of Germans, there's a lot of people who live in the South. And they're as much my kin as anybody. So I guess you could say that I'm a closet Southerner.
How did The South Was Right by the Kennedy brothers end up in the bibliography of a book about Norway in World War II?
Okay, what I have listed 2 separate forms of books. One is, the first half of my list has to do with books that are directly used in the publication of my book. And the second list is suggested reading in no particular order in English. And the reason they're suggested reading is that many of the things that are listed in those books are very similar to describing the same circumstances that existed in Norway under the occupation by the Nazis, and why it was that the Norwegian underground did what they did. In other words, the similarity between, let's say, the Southern cause and the emigrant cause are really not that different. And so I'm drawing some parallels there, and also showing people how people keep reinventing the wheel. The same thing keeps happening over and over, and it doesn't matter whether it happens to be the South, the Revolutionary War, the emigrant in Norway, or any number of other things. They all have a common thread, and that's the point that I want to leave people with.
Well, I've definitely enjoyed having you as our guest today, and I've definitely look forward to getting a copy of your book and being able to read it.
Yeah, I think you'll enjoy it. I think you'll find it very easy reading, and there's lots of pictures in it. There's like 300 pictures in it, and documents and all kinds of stuff. So you kind of get a chance to not only just feel what someone is saying, but you can also kind of see it. And when you can both see and read, then, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So it's much easier just to say, well, this is the way it is, and then you can talk about other things rather than to have to describe it. and not do as good a job because you don't have that picture.
Right.
So, yeah, a copy of that book will go out sometime this week.
Well, that'll be good. I appreciate that.
And I'm always interested in cause and effect. Why do things happen? Why do people do this? And why do they do that? And I'm interested in people's motivations and their altruistic sense of right and wrong. So, it's a matter of whatever the spirit moves, I guess is the way to put it. Anyway, I really do appreciate the opportunity to get together with you today and have a chance to talk about a lot of different things. There's lots of interesting things to discuss. And I really appreciate what you're doing. And you're doing a lot of detailed work that's primarily Southern-oriented, but there's an awful lot of stuff there that reminds me of people in other areas who've had similar problems and have suffered. Well, you're a fascinating man, and I really enjoy reading your newsletter, and I'm going to look forward to seeing the articles that you've written in the Barnes Review. That's a good magazine, and it's worth supporting. Regardless, I've had probably 8 articles published there. Not any this year yet.
I'll say feel free to reach out to me anytime. I've enjoyed the conversation tremendously.
Well, I have too. It's tremendous, and really, and maybe one day I'll have an opportunity to come back in that part of the country, and we can sit down and I'll buy you lunch or something. Okay. We'll just see what happens. Do
you ever make it down to Florida? Take the grandkids to Disney World or anything like that?
Well, I don't care much for Disney. I used to like Disney when Walt was in it, but ever since that, I'm not a real big Disney fan, but I can think of other reasons for going down there.
Pull into Disney, all the employees, at the parking lot and, at the ticket box and everywhere else, they always say, well, have a magical day. I'm like, the only magic trick around here is that you make my money disappear.
Yeah. Oh, there's one other thing I wanted to mention. I happened to hear your interview with Cooter.
Okay.
And I really liked it. I really did. And I like him, but I really liked that. I liked the approach to it. I liked him, and you do a nice job in talking to him because you're folksy and act like a human being, and that's what he comes across as.
I've got an article coming up in the next Barnes Review, which is actually a condensation of my second interview with Cooter.
Super. That's super.
And Cooter basically explains, he says that Martin Luther King was a Southerner.
Uh-huh.
And that the key leaders of the civil rights movement, and I asked him how he got involved in politics.
Right.
And he started out in the civil rights movement when he was in college, and he worked for Dr. King. Dr. King was recruiting politically minded, intelligent, white college students, and Dr. King recruited him because he was a good writer. And he worked for Dr. King. And he said that Dr. King was a Southerner. He said that the original civil rights movement, he said that there was no problem with Confederate flags or Confederate monuments. He said because they were all Southerners. He said, and that was just much a part of their culture as it was, anybody else's, be they white or, whatever.
Well, I would agree with that.
Yeah. And so I asked him, I said, so then why is it that the civil rights movement today is so anti-anything Confederate?
And for those of you who are listening and want to know what Cooter said, you're just going to have to read the July-August issue of the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review, of course, is our sponsor here on TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, hence the TBR in TBR Radio Presents. But we are out of time once again, and so I'd like to thank Harald for being our guest. I've really enjoyed talking to him. And want to encourage all of our listeners to get a copy of his book, An Immigrant Remembers. Type in Harald Scharnhorst, Scharnhorst, into Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo or whatever your preferred search engine is. And find Harald's blog, find his writings on the internet, find An Immigrant Remembers, find some of the YouTube videos that he's put up there. And I believe that you'll really enjoy reading and viewing Harald's online material. I'd also like to encourage you to go to my website, www.dixieheritage.net. And while you're there, you can sign up to receive a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. And we'll also sign you up at that time to receive our free weekly Dixie Heritage email newsletter. And it won't cost you a penny. You won't have to give us your postal address or your phone number or your credit card number or any other number. Just give us a valid email address and we'll get that right out to you. Another thing I want to encourage you to do is go to the Barnes Review website and click on the TBR Radio tab. And the reason why is it will pull up
the past broadcasts of the Dixie Heritage Hour. And when you do, of course, you'll see the radio interviews with Cooter, Ben Jones, Congressman Ben Jones, who played Cooter on the Dukes of Hazzard, that Harold and I were talking about. And it'll give you a chance to go back to, I believe they were broadcast in February and March, but I'm saying that from memory, so if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But they're in the archives there on the TBR Radio website. Be sure to check that out. Anyways, on behalf of all of us here at TBR Radio presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, thank you once again for being with us. Come back to the same place, same time next week, and listen to us again. Until then, God bless.